and welcome to a special episode of Turn the Page. For this episode, Jessikah and I spoke to the editor of and several contributors to a wonderful book of essays called Absolute Pleasure: Queer Perspectives on Rocky Horror. Jessikah and I are both huge fans of Rocky Horror, and this book is full of beautiful essays. So what follows is going to be a bunch of short, let's say, speed dating type interviews with some of the contributors. Enjoy.
Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I am your host today, Jen, and I am so excited to talk to the editor of this volume, who has also made some contributions to the volume itself. But I am so excited to kick off our examination of this book and talks with some of its contributors with this. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me to the show. My name is Margot Atwell, and I am an editor, publisher, writer, and creative community builder. I'm the editor of this anthology, Absolute Pleasure: Queer Perspectives on Rocky Horror.
I'd love if we could start by talking about the inception point for this volume. You tell a little bit of the story in the book itself, but I'm really curious about, the night or the event from which this book sprung.
Sure. I'm not sure how much this was visible in the introduction, but this was kind of coming together in the summer into the fall of 2022. And I was executive director and publisher of Feminist Press. So I was thinking a lot about feminism and gender and what we do with creative projects and artworks from the past that maybe haven't always aged perfectly well. And I was also working on It Came from the Closet by Jo Valisi. We were promoting it that fall. And that book invites queer and trans writers to talk about horror films that were impactful to them and kind of like wrestle with representation and a lot more. So it occurred to me that Rocky Horror was actually about to turn 50 in a few years. And it was something that was really important to me when I was coming up because representation was so little and so bad for queer and gender nonconforming people when I was a teenager. But I was curious because the world has changed a lot since I was a teenager, especially in the last 10 years. So I was curious if Rocky Horror still meant the same thing to younger people. And there was an event at the Brooklyn Museum that was promoting It Came from the Closet, and two of the contributors were talking. And when the Q&A section happened, someone leaned forward and said into the microphone, "What do you say to people who say that, old queer things like Rocky Horror are problematic and queer baiting?" And Carmen Maria Machado leaned forward on stage and said, "Tell them to say it to my face," which got a big laugh. But yeah, as I was leaving, I was walking with a colleague who was about 10 years younger than me, and we were talking about Rocky Horror and what it meant to me versus, it just had not been in his life the way it had been in mine. So at that point, I was thinking about different queer and trans generations and thought this could be a really interesting way to explore a lot of different issues in the queer community over the past years.
So how did you go about seeking contributions and how did you select them? And I'm always really curious about how do you order them? How do you, find the ways in which they speak to each other and how to, present them to the reader?
So early on, I had a partner, a co-editor, Tanika Stotts, who helped with a lot of the vision for the project. I just want to make sure that she gets credit because she was instrumental in helping to design this with me in a lot of the process. So we kind of set out to figure out like what shape we wanted, like what lengths of pieces. We put together a wish list of, writers that we would love to have in the anthology, and decided that we would pay them as much as we reasonably could, because paying writers and creative people is really important to me. And so we did do direct outreach to a lot of writers that we admired. It's kind of hard to be able to guess if someone has strong feelings about Rocky Horror, but we actually we hit on a few of them. And then I did a big open call. I promoted it online. Feminist Press reshared it and posted it on their site. And then I talked to a lot of people in person, like at AWP, which is the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. They have a big literary conference every year. So I talked to people there, and I just kind of mentioned it in a lot of places. So yeah, I would say we got in the sort of like 50 to 60 submission range, which is fewer than I've had for submissions in the past, but this is so niche and specific. And so many of the essays were really great. I ended up letting the book sprawl a little because there were so many essays and so many different perspectives I wanted to make sure I included. But yeah, like once I went through and said like all of these are amazing essays that I could see in the collection, at that point I was really thinking about what stories they told, and whose perspectives were or were not represented in the book, and tried to make sure that I like covered a fair amount of ground. And so I did, as it went on, solicit a few more pieces to make sure that it was as broad and inclusive an anthology as possible. I am a very analog person for a very digital world. So I actually printed all the essays, and I went through and read them, and then I had a folder of like all of the like yes definitelys and maybes, and I was kind of just carrying that around and reviewing them for a while. And I started to get a sense that I wanted the beginning of the book to introduce people who are less familiar with Rocky Horror to the film, kind of like the stories and mythos around the film, and some of the really unique elements of the film's culture and community. The shadow casting, where people dress up in costumes and stand in front of the screen and like act out the film as the film's going. And then the callbacks, where people who attend the film yell in response to or sort of setting up the film for punchlines. That's something I really haven't seen with almost any other films. So I wanted the early essays to kind of, bring people in and have just be a little less complex subjects to wrestle with, so that they felt like they were drawing you in and you kind of like were like getting into the water. And then some of the more critical or like cultural criticism type essays, I put more in the middle. Once I'd already kind of established for the reader, like, this is what this is, here are some different perspectives about it. And at the end, I thought a lot about what I wanted to leave the readers with. So I tried to be really deliberate about that. And so I kind of had like 3 sections in my mind. And then within that, I tried to create a bit of a flow. So the essays were like, felt like they were in conversation with each other, but I also wanted to make sure that there weren't too many like very sad essays in a row or very long essays in a row. So I tried to vary the tone and length a little bit to just create some variety for people.
Yeah, I imagine that's a really complex process, and it's really, I think, fascinating the way that they, each tell their story, and then you do have this arc that makes the book very accessible if you're not super familiar with the film. So I guess my last question is about your contribution. You wrote an intro and an essay called Going Home. Could you just introduce our listeners to the essay a little bit, and perhaps what was the inception point for your contribution?
It was funny to be working on my essay and the introduction at the same time. And it took me quite a while to realize that pieces of what I had in the intro actually felt more like my personal story. With the introduction, I wanted to introduce people to the project itself, kind of like set them in time, and also give some context around the film and cultural history that Rocky Horror was created into. So I talked about the Hays Code, which was a film industry code that prevented filmmakers who wanted their films to be distributed from showing like vice or being sympathetic to people who were committing crimes or sort of like doing things that were against social norms, like being gay. And I think that code where you either couldn't have gay people or trans people on the screen, or they had to be punished and get their comeuppance by the end of the film. I think that, which I think was in effect from something like the 1930s until 1968, or 5 years before Rocky Horror, the show, was created. I think that those queer-coded villains and like their comeuppance are really kind of like encoded into the DNA of American culture in a way that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, because that, something that ended in 1968, it's multiple generations ago, but it has had this really ongoing effect. So yeah, I wanted to kind of like give context for readers. And when I was finishing the introduction, it was December 2024 and January 2025. So right after Trump had been elected, but before he was inaugurated, and trying to think of what to say to people who would be reading this book in September or later. It was a really odd thought exercise for me, and I hope I did it. And then my own piece. I'm not typically a writer of personal nonfiction, so it actually was a very like difficult and vulnerable process for me. And I talked about how little I knew about gay people at all as a kid, and the little bits I knew and started to learn as I became a teenager. That was the 80s and 90s and early 90s were the rise of the HIV and AIDS crisis, and mainstream society was not kind about how it talked about people with HIV and AIDS. And there were like Jerry Springer and Jerry Falwell and a lot of other people that had some pretty inflammatory, hateful rhetoric. So Rocky Horror was this kind of like Dorothy landing in Oz moment for me, where like I didn't even know that women could be gay, and then I like saw that film, and it was like kind of knocked me over to see like that kind of like unabashed queer weird joy. And everyone in that film who come up in Frankenstein Place, they're just like very much themselves, for good or ill. And yeah, I think I, like a lot of folks who wrote for the book, kind of came into it feeling very much like Janet, or some other folks felt like Brad. And I feel like it's been the work of my life to be able to be the kind of person who can show my full self to the world. And this project has been really a big part of that.
That's so lovely. And, I think that to your earlier point about how, we are at the 50-year anniversary, the fact that it's coming at this sort of like, we've been saying unprecedented for so long that it doesn't really mean anything, but at this particular unprecedented moment in a succession of them. It's a really interesting time, I think, like culturally, politically, and personally for all of us to sort of be returning to, this movie and its legacy. And I really appreciated all of the different perspectives. It was really told me a lot, I think, about different people's experiences of the film and intergenerational change and all these sorts of interesting things. So thank you so much for bringing it to the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me a chance to talk about it.
All right, on to the next mini interview.
Awesome.
Hello, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, yeah. I'm Aliya Bree Hall. I am one of the contributors of Absolute Pleasure. I have a essay in it titled "A Wild and Untamed Thing: How Being in an RHPS Shadow Cast Helped Me Discover My Bodily Autonomy." So you can imagine lots of queer issues, autonomy issues, all that stuff.
It's lovely. It's so moving and so insightful. One of the things that you get at in this essay is about being a cast member, and you explore the relationship between bodily autonomy, consent, and shame in really interesting ways as it pertains to like this live performance. What was the inception point for the essay? Was it like, how did this come to be?
Yeah, so I actually saw the call for these essays the last week that they were open for submissions and was like, I have a lot of feelings about Rocky and I gotta get in here. So I started to just like really think about what exactly Rocky meant to me, and all these memories started to come up of performing in the shadow cast and what a gift that was in my life. And so came from there.
And, I mean, first of all, it was so much fun to read, especially as someone who has attended shadow casts of Rocky.
Mhm.
One of the things I want to know is because you talk a lot just about it, and it is a culture, Rocky itself. While you were writing this essay, which is about discovering bodily autonomy through doing this, was there anything that you hadn't thought of before that sort of came up as you were writing? Did you have a
Mm,
mid-essay epiphany that you
Mm.
might like to share with us?
yeah, one of the earlier sections of the essay, I talk about some experiences that happened in my childhood that weren't necessarily like, oh, like a repressed memory or anything, but it was something that I hadn't really considered how that had like impacted my relationship with my body. And it really wasn't until this essay, as I'm like diving into why Rocky opened that up for me, that I was able to be like, oh, yeah, that's like where this like really started and came from.
I had never really thought before this essay about the live performances being a place where queer people could find each other, a sort of safe space in because those were done from the cities to suburbia, they sort of somehow ended up everywhere with this extreme cult appeal.
Way before influencer culture, by the way.
Yeah, yeah, before the
Yeah.
internet,
Yeah.
linked fandoms up and everything like that.
Hmm.
Organic, like kind
Mhm.
of spontaneous communities that were found. Yeah, I'm wondering about like your experience in the cast. Did you develop like important friendships, relationships like that you still carry to this day?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a like uh core member, like core like three members that I am still pretty close with. One of which one of them got married recently, and all of like the two other members that she was really close with, we were invited. And during the reception, she put on the time warp and brought us all up to like perform it, which was very fun and very just like, wow, I haven't like done the time warp since like college. But it was just like so cool to be able to experience that and to still like stay in touch and have Rocky as like that touchstone in our lives.
I have to ask, like, what was your feeling when you first saw Rocky? Like your first, like how did it kind of jump out to you as this is a thing that I want to participate in?
Yeah. So first I'm seeing it like with the shadow cast. Yeah. I had a friend at the time who was in the cast and invited me to go see it. And I'm like, yeah, I'll go and support you. I saw Rocky, like the movie when I was in high school and loved it, but had never seen the shadow cast before. And so was like, yeah, I'll go see it and support you. And then was just like, oh, this looks like so much fun. And what a cool way to bring this to life. And I was pretty immediately sold.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible experience. And, you were talking about, just sort of experiencing it again after a long time. I recently
Mhm.
watched the movie for like what is probably the first time in like 15, if not like 20 years,
Oh
which
my
is
goodness.
terrifying that things even possible. Um,
Right.
um, and it's amazing how like it was all still in me, like every single word,
Mhm.
every single song, the images, the timing, like it's just like it really like cemented for me like how important like a text it is not only in my own identity but in so many people and their development as people and yeah, it's really lovely.
It's so cool to see how it just like continues to be so impactful. I recently watched it with people who had never seen it before, and they were very much like, no, I want the Shadowcast experience. Can you please talk over the movie? Because I had a minute of like, I don't know the last time I just watched the movie without like doing callbacks and like what a like different type of experience. And they're like, no, no, like please give it to us. So that was just a one person show of all the callbacks I could remember. And it was crazy what was like buried in there.
Good. All right. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your essay and your time.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Hi, could we ask you to introduce yourself and your essay, please?
Hi, my name is Benjamin Larned. My essay for Absolute Pleasure is called Who Lives in the Old Dark House?
Yeah, it was one of my favorites because it's something that led me to learning about something else, which was the old dark house.
Thank you for saying so. Yeah, I'm a
Yeah.
huge fan of Whale as well as Rocky Horror, so it was fun to try to draw the connection.
Yeah, I saw that movie, The Old Dark House, for the first time during the pandemic when I had a plan born of boredom that I was going to watch every movie on Shudder in chronological order. So that was very early. Um, and it's remarkable. So could you do a little bit of just introducing our listeners to the film in case they haven't heard of it? And maybe tell us a little bit about how it found its way into your essay about Rocky Horror.
Absolutely. So, The Old Dark House is a 1932 film by director James Whale, who's most famous for Universal Monsters, Frankenstein, and The Bride of Frankenstein. So Old Dark House was his second film for Universal. It's his one of his least known, but very queer, uh, especially for the time. There's just so much subtext. Everything is a little off kilter. It's a classic setup of a normative couple and their bachelor friend get trapped in a secluded mansion during a storm, and the inhabitants are a little strange, ranging from unusual to dangerous, which is, of course, a very familiar setup when you're talking about Rocky Horror. So I had seen the film before. I was a huge fan of the Universal Monsters as a child and hadn't heard of the Old Dark House until much later. But I had just happened to rewatch the film before hearing about Absolute Pleasure when it was still in the development phase, and happened to watch Rocky Horror around the same time again and thought, oh, there's actually a lot of very superficial parallels and some deeper running themes that go through both. And so it felt like a fun opportunity to track not only the history of that sort of representation in horror, but also to look at what do those queered messages mean in our current context. And the answer is a little ambivalent and complicated, but
So I mean, I'm curious just in general, which came first for you? What did you Rocky or the Old Dark House?
for sure. So in the timeline, which I discuss a little bit in the essay, I came upon the Universal Monsters, the classic films, at a very young age, and did not know about the Old Dark House until after I had already seen Rocky Horror. I watched Rocky Horror for the first time when I was 16, even though I had heard about it and knew the legacy from a long time ago. I wasn't allowed, of course, to watch it until I was a bit older. So that movie had a huge impact on me at the time. And I didn't end up watching The Old Dark House until I was in my 20s. I think it had popped up on the Criterion channel, or it might have been Shudder actually as well. So either way, but it just really struck me the first time I watched it how not only bizarre and subversive, but just how deep the queer themes ran with these secluded family members who all felt like they were a form of queer identity hiding away from the world and letting themselves rot basically in this tomb of their own making. So that those themes kind of stuck in my head, and then when it came time to work on this essay, it all just clicked together.
One of my favorite parts of the essay is when you talk about actually Frank's closing number, the I'm coming home, and just all of the complicated feelings that come up in that song. It's very joyful in places, but it's very sad and it's just a lot of feelings. It like runs the entire gamut. And I guess my question is like, it runs that gamut from despair to sort of like transcendent joy. What do you think it means? Because this is like a theme in the essay, I think, but having to find resonance or familiarity or find a part of yourself in texts that are so contradictory, because you talk about the contradiction wrapped up in that scene and in the end of the movie that it is happy, but it is not happy. There's a lot of like very complicated things going on. So I kind of lost the question in there, but could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh no, for sure. Yeah, that was the theme that kind of came out while I was working on the different pieces of the essay. That felt like the connective tissue, but it's something I think about a lot. And in the introduction to the book that Carmen Maria Machado wrote, which is wonderful, she mentions thinking about Rocky Horror in the context of this imperfect representation that when you're a queer person who was born several decades ago, as opposed to in the 2000s, when these conversations about representation have been very public, ongoing for a long time, obviously very contentious, and we're very far from that kind of perfect place where representation isn't an issue. But to find yourself in that space that isn't necessarily made for you, I think there's something really powerful about that. But part of being queer too is embracing all facets of that existence. Is obviously not all pride and joy. It can be loneliness and trauma and self-hatred and just you're still a human being dealing with all of the griefs that human beings deal with. Being queer doesn't erase any of that. So it's a question that I think about obviously as a writer, as a consumer of media. Where what is our responsibility, I guess, in not only pushing things forward, but also honoring history, because these representations have been there for obviously the Old Dark House is over 80 years old, or pardon me, I think it's over 90 years old now. And then Rocky Horror just turned 50, and we're still having this conversation. So I think it's that holding that complexity is really important for me, and it also just makes it interesting. It's a really fun lens to view media through.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. And it speaks to both the wider legacy and to the moment that we find ourselves in. It's such an interesting essay. Thanks for coming and sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me and for promoting the project. I'm so excited to be a part of it, and all the perspectives in the book are so unique and fascinating.
Hello, could you introduce yourself and your essay, please?
Hello. Yeah, my name is Pavel, and the name of my essay is Brief Encounters with Dr. Frankenfurter.
It's a great essay, and in it you call for a reevaluation of the film's legacy and its live performance culture. Could you tell us a little bit about your first encounter with the film?
Yeah, so definitely first encountered it through like cultural osmosis, from posters around Chicago to Tumblr GIFs to references in other media. Even the font of the film, it like the red dripping blood is super iconic. And I think even before I watched the movie, I actually used that font as a design in a poster I made.
So, part of like the beginning of your essay, you talk about the different times where you almost made that first encounter, not just in passing, but you actually almost watched the film, but then it just didn't happen. I was curious for you, how much timing played into your experiences, both watching the film for the first time and seeing a live performance versus all those other times you could have seen it for the first time and, had kind of, I guess, a near miss, or, a pivot away at the moment.
Yeah, I really like this question because I think in terms of time, like my own relationship to the film has evolved in between the times that I saw it and like versus like the live performance and just seeing it at home and then seeing it just like as part of the culture. I think the world itself has also changed. I first almost watched it in 2020, which was a really, really pivotal moment, obviously, with the pandemic. And I was in quarantine and I ended up not watching it. And then I ended up actually watching it in the spring of 2024, which was before the election. And then I saw the live performance in December 2024, which was after the elections. So yeah, I guess what I want to say is I think I have changed. I changed throughout that time. Even my the material conditions of my life changed during from that time. I was a college student, then I was a grad student.
So one of the most interesting points in your essay, I thought, was let's say, you talk about how when people talk about the movie, they often conflate sexual awakening and sexual liberation, which I think is a super interesting issue. And how do you think this relates to a lot of the consent issues and the power dynamics of the movie that you talk about in your essay?
I think my issue with I guess in the movie, I guess Janet and Brad's sexual liberation was not necessarily liberatory is kind of the argument that I was trying to get at in my essay, because even though, and I think this has to do with the question of violence, in that the Janet and Brad's liberation, I think, was coerced. And so, of course, some theorists might argue that liberation requires a kind of violent rupture with one's like understanding of the world. Um, but even if that's true, I think that the issue, even if we accept that gaining new knowledge is an inherently violent experience, even if that's the case, I think the issue is that there's no consent. And so I can't accept that sexual liberation can be liberatory if you don't consent to it. Or maybe I ask the question, is sexual liberation liberatory if you didn't consent to it? Because at the moment of seduction in the film, the liberation relies on deception.
Mm. That is a really great point, I think. And because I think you're absolutely correct that even if this sort of liberatory experience of learning something new about
Yeah.
yourself or about the world is inherently violent, there's something so different about choosing to engage with that violence and having it, to pun the movie a little bit, thrust upon you, like it's
Yeah.
a different experience.
And I mean, it's also in line with re-examining other similar things in movies such as Revenge of the Nerds and the whole Darth Vader scene where, he's wearing a Darth Vader mask and he sleeps with somebody who thought that he was her boyfriend. And, like I remember being like, ugh, like that's totally not cool. But, and like everybody at the time, like that was an iconic movie. And I think now, we've kind of gone to re-examining things that we find iconic and being like, well, was that, like what are we really looking at here? Because that's not consensual. Like that's it's not, yeah. So I think, it is important to re-examine old media, and especially media that's iconic or has as big a cult following as Rocky does.
Yeah. And I think it's super interesting too. And this is one of the things that I love that your essay engages with is sort of like the ways that different generations can relate to different media in different ways. And I'm curious if you think that like this phenomenon of like the changing reception of Rocky Horror over time and like tons of other sort of like foundational queer texts that might be received differently now, do you think this tells us anything about intergenerational shifts in the queer community and how we can navigate them?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question. I think that it hints at a big issue in our time, which is just generally conflicting and differing values across generations. And so I think what was acceptable 50 or 20 years ago is not acceptable today. I'm not familiar with the reference that Jessica made, but I totally hear you. Yeah, the description it's like revolting. And I think that especially for literature and film, this stands out even more because I think they are narrative works of art as opposed to non-narrative. And I think that if a work of art includes a narrative, then we as viewers or readers, we can make moral and ethical judgments about the choices that the characters are making.
Yeah.
And so when our values change across generations, then our judgments will also change. And so I guess for me, my hope is that we can change the way we evaluate art within our community. And so if we think about whether the work of art is effective as opposed to good or bad, I think that can be really helpful, particularly if there are differences among like intergenerational communities. I guess what my hope is that community elders would make space for younger folks' opinions, because I think so often they get shut down. And if we embrace the complexity in our communities, like maybe we'll come out stronger, but that could also be really idealistic of me.
Fair. I mean, and also like I think like with Rocky, we're talking about like the queer community, like a community that's been marginalized throughout history. And, each generation has its own experiences with that. So I don't know. I'd like to be optimistic with you as well.
Yeah. And maybe like, I don't know, one of the answers, I mean, is there an answer? And if there are many, but like, I feel like a lot of what intergenerational conversations can use is like, as you mentioned, holding space and a sort of like resilience against becoming defensive, because I think like
Absolutely.
that, as somebody who grew up with the movie and like had it mean something really important to me, I can totally understand that impulse to be like, well, this movie saved my life. Like it can't be bad, like, and like that's great for you, but like it's not going to mean that for everybody. And it's actually maybe a good thing that there are more sorts of texts available now that we don't have to necessarily cling to like really problematic ones. So
yes.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I think also this is probably just the case in marginalized communities where we already feel like we don't belong to the majority, and we already feel a sense of, not a sense of persecution, but just like a sense of vulnerability just given your positionality. And so I think to hear something that you love be attacked is just like all the more painful and shocking. And so I guess it's just more important to tread carefully and nicely and respectfully.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it felt like a really important addition I was going to say addition to the conversation, but I think also like a conversation starter about different ways to look at the media that matters a lot to us and how that might change over time and how different perspectives can even like deepen our understanding of a text over time. So it's all really useful and fascinating. Thank you for
Yes,
joining us.
absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this special episode. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.